Ukrainian soldiers are speaking out. Europe is horrified into silence. He was deaf, had a head injury, and was still sent to the front. Alexander Prozenko, a Ukrainian prisoner of war, is saying what Western media is concealing. The Ukrainian army is throwing the sick, disabled, and mentally unstable to the front like cannon fodder. "We were meat," he says, and he means it literally. In his brigade, soldiers committed suicide. Others ran away or went insane. There were cases of cannibalism. Yes, cannibalism. Soldiers who didn't even know where they were had to fight until they died or surrendered. Many chose the latter. We smoked a cigarette, laid down our weapons, and surrendered. That's how another prisoner describes it. Morale is dead. Discipline has collapsed, yet the West continues to supply weapons. Why? Why is Brussels blindly supporting a regime that is burning through its own men, and who really benefits from this war continuing? While Ukrainian soldiers despair in the trenches, Vladimir Putin continues to escalate. In September alone, over 3,500 drone attacks, 190 missiles, 2,500 bombs, a massive blow against Kiev's infrastructure, energy facilities, bridges, residential buildings. Nothing is safe anymore. But anyone who thinks it's just about destruction is sorely mistaken. The Kremlin is pursuing a clear goal: peace on Russian terms. According to Kremlin circles, military escalation is not an end in itself, but a means of pressure. Putin wants to force the West to bring Zelensky to the negotiating table or drop him. His calculation: whoever suffers will give in. In Moscow, there is open talk that the current U.S. government under Trump is seriously interested in a solution. Putin senses support, diplomatically and strategically. He is showing himself to be open. If common sense prevails, a compromise is possible. If not, we'll solve it by force. It's the classic game of carrot and stick. Negotiations are offered while bombs are falling. The West is reacting in a divided manner. While some EU states continue to supply weapons, others are quietly doubting Zelensky's rigid stance. Trump is also seizing the opportunity to present himself as the only interlocutor who can both talk to Putin and put pressure on Zelensky. Putin knows that the longer the war lasts, the more weary the West becomes, politically, economically, morally. And that is precisely where his opportunity lies. If Europe and the U.S. cannot agree on a common line, Moscow can dictate the peace process, step by step. The question is no longer whether Putin wants peace, but whether the West is willing to pay his price. Putin is signaling his willingness to talk. Trump is offering himself as a mediator, but one person is resisting: Volodymyr Zelensky. For many, he was long regarded as a hero, but now the shine is beginning to wear off. Because while the world is looking for a diplomatic solution, the Ukrainian president says, no negotiations, not an inch of land, no compromises. At first, this stance seemed like steadfastness. But with each week of war, with each new grave, it seems more like political obstinacy. Behind the scenes, critical voices are growing. A European diplomat says anonymously, Zelensky is not only fighting against Russia, but increasingly against the zeitgeist. Trump is openly following up. He claims that there is pure hatred between Zelensky and Putin, and that he will probably have to talk alone, a targeted message to his supporters and the international stage. I am the only one who can bring peace, and Zelensky is suddenly becoming a minor matter, or worse, an obstacle. At the same time, the military situation is becoming increasingly desperate. Prisoners of war report on a shocking state at the front. People with disabilities, drug addicts, even mentally ill men are forcibly conscripted, without training, without a plan, directly onto the battlefield. One prisoner says, "We didn't even know where we were. It was like a nightmare. Some went crazy." Another, "There was cannibalism. These words are in the room and no one in the West dares to say them out loud." The question arises, How long can Zelensky maintain this course, politically and morally? More and more politicians in Europe are asking themselves the same question. How much support can still be justified if the price seems infinitely high and the goal unattainable? Trump recognizes these doubts and uses them. He is positioning himself as the only one who can talk to Putin and convince the West. At the same time, Zelensky is being pushed further and further into a corner. The Ukrainian president, a symbol of resistance, is threatening to become an obstacle to a peace process. It is no longer just about territories. It is about power, influence, and control over the narrative. Whoever is perceived as a peacemaker determines how history is written, and currently, Zelensky has to fight this battle against two overpowering opponents: Russia on the outside, Trump in the West. The reality is brutal. If even anxious allies express doubts, if people on the front lines surrender, if diplomatic windows open and only one refuses to go through, then the perception tips, and it tips quickly. What happens if the U.S. negotiates peace without Ukraine, if Europe gets tired and the pressure on Kiev grows? And above all, what remains of Zelensky's legacy if he chose the wrong moment to say no? While Brussels hesitates and Zelensky blocks, an old acquaintance re-enters the stage. More determined than ever, Donald Trump. The former U.S. president has long since begun preparing his foreign policy agenda for his return to the White House, and Europe plays only a minor role in it, or worse, no role at all. What many overlook is that Trump's advisors have already begun to establish contacts with European politicians in Berlin, Paris, Warsaw, meeting photos, deals in the background. The goal is clear: build influence, create alliances, strengthen critical voices. According to the New York Times, EU officials are already warning of dangerous interference in internal affairs. But Trump's camp doesn't seem to care. On the contrary, because Trump understands Europe's weakness as his opportunity. He knows that without America, Europe is militarily almost helpless, and with Russia at its back, fear and blackmail are the biggest political tools. We beginnen ersten details. Samossundas. Instead of diplomacy, Trump relies on dominance. Instead of partnership, on obedience. The message to Brussels is clear. Whoever doesn't follow is out. The consequence? A dangerous paradigm shift. More and more decisions in Europe are based not on interests, but on fear of reaction from Washington. Trade concessions are made because of fear of sanctions. Security deals are signed even though they weaken Europe economically. And even the EU's new sanctions package shows this genuflection. LNG is banned, but Russian oil continues to flow. Why? Because they don't want to mess with Hungary, because they are afraid of internal cohesion, and because they fear Trump's anger, even before he is back in office. Brussels speaks of autonomy, but acts like a vassal. Ursula von der Leyen's harsh words are regularly relativized by her own commissioners. The attempt to show strength to the outside world ends in internal contradictions, and in the midst of this powerlessness, Trump's influence is growing unstoppably. He presents himself as a strong man who speaks plainly, while Europe's elites get lost in platitudes, and it works. Approval ratings for parties close to Trump are rising in France, Germany, and the Netherlands. The message is the same everywhere. Brussels is weak, and Washington is the real power factor. For Europe, this means a dangerous downward spiral. The more you cling to America, the more dependent you become. And the more dependent you become, the less you dare to represent your own interests. The result? Strategic self-surrender in the name of transatlantic unity, which has long existed only on paper. Trump knows this, and he uses it. While Europe is still discussing, he has long since begun to dominate it. Not with tanks, but with fear. Not with alliances, but with deals. And not as a partner, but as the sole pacemaker of a new order. The question is no longer whether Europe will follow Trump, but whether Europe will even be allowed to decide whom it follows. While Trump is embracing Europe and Putin is threatening with missiles, a frightening reality is revealed. The European Union is militarily, politically, and strategically disarmed, and its reaction is pure panic. The proof, the so-called 19th sanctions package of the EU. With great fanfare, Ursula von der Leyen announced an end to Russian energy imports. It is time to turn off the tap, according to the President of the Commission. But what followed was a diplomatic embarrassment. Only the import of Russian liquefied gas was banned. However, the oil continues to flow. Moscow's largest sources of money remain open in the middle of the war. Why? Because Brussels is afraid. Afraid of Hungary, which enforced an exception. Afraid of a winter without energy. Afraid of social unrest. And above all, afraid of itself. Because the truth is bitter. Behind the doors of the EU, things are brewing. France wants a European defense shield. Germany delivers weapons, but no vision. Italy is struggling with its own insecurity. Poland fears Putin's next step, and Hungary is playing a double game as a member of the EU, and at the same time a partner of Moscow. Unity looks different. While Russian MiGs violate Estonian airspace and Moscow denies any responsibility, the EU cannot even react in unison. Instead, more debates, more compromises, more paper tigers. Reality is ignored because it is too painful. Europe stands naked, militarily dependent on NATO, economically under pressure, politically divided. In Brussels, they talk about strategic autonomy, but in reality, Washington dictates the pace. An EU diplomat recently said, "We no longer decide anything, we only react." And that is exactly what Trump is using. While Europe is maneuvering, he is setting facts. His advisors meet with critical parties, his influence grows, and Brussels is paralyzed. The attempted conversion of frozen Russian assets into aid loans for Ukraine has not yet been decided. Over 200 billion euros are fixed, but no one knows how to use them legally. Weeks pass while Russia gains time and Europe gets in its own way. Even high-ranking commissioners are now publicly relativizing the sanctions. A spokesman had to admit sheepishly, there is still a lot of work to be done in the coming weeks, not months. A wording that should sound like music in Moscow's ears. The contradiction between tough rhetoric and hesitant reality is dangerous, because while Brussels talks about strength, every action shows weakness, and this weakness is felt not only by Russia, but also by its own population. Rising energy prices, social tensions, growing doubts, the fear that this war will not only affect Ukraine, but destabilize all of Europe, has long been real. In this chaos, Brussels loses its last authority, and the vacuum that arises is filled by others. Putin with violence, Trump with power politics. Europe is at a turning point, and if it does not act soon, it will lose not only the war, but also itself. While Brussels hesitates and Washington plays strategically, Putin's war machine rolls on relentlessly with a mixture of brutal force and cold calculation. What at first glance looks like a pure war of conquest is increasingly turning out to be a tactical double blow. Attack on the front, invitation to the negotiating table. But on whose terms? Since the failed summit with Zelensky in the summer, it has been clear to Putin that peace is only achievable if Kyiv falls. politically or militarily. His strategy is therefore two-pronged. The harshest military strikes combined with diplomatic smoke grenades. In September alone, Russia rained 3,500 drones, 190 missiles, and over 2,500 bombs on Ukrainian targets. The heaviest attacks since the beginning of the invasion. Energy centers, train stations, residential areas, everything is hit. The message: we can strike anytime, anywhere. But despite this brutality, Putin's tone towards the West remains remarkably constructive. In interviews, he emphasizes that if common sense prevails, a compromise is possible. At the same time, he warns, if not, we will solve everything by force. It is a game with an open visor, and Europe reacts as if paralyzed. Because Putin's calculation goes deeper. He knows that the longer the war lasts, the weaker the support for Zelensky becomes. The more brutal the winter, the more shaky the solidarity. The higher the losses, the louder the call for peace. And that is exactly where he starts. By presenting himself as a necessary part of any peace solution, he forces the West into a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, he is ostracized as an aggressor. On the other hand, he remains irreplaceable. Even Trump had to admit this when he said that without Russia, there will be no solution, a message that sits deep, especially in Brussels. So while rockets are hitting, the Kremlin is deliberately spreading narratives. Zelensky is the real obstacle. Kyiv is refusing talks. The West is divided. And in parts it is even true, because while Russia is bombing, many EU states remain silent for fear of being drawn even deeper. Estonia reports airspace violations by Mix. Moscow denies it. The NATO remains silent. At the same time, Russian diplomats are moving closer together with Chinese and African partners, building new alliances to slow down the West, economically and politically. In the UN General Assembly, Europe is more isolated than ever. Even neutral states are increasingly siding with Moscow, not out of sympathy but out of strategic calculation. Putin is not only playing on the battlefield, but on the global chessboard, and his moves are having an effect. Public opinion in Europe is slowly tipping. In France, Germany, Italy, discontent is growing over arms deliveries, over rising costs, over an endless escalation. Many ask themselves, is peace more important than principles, or is that just surrender? And that is exactly Putin's goal, a Europe that gives up internally before it falls militarily. While Zelensky relies on toughness and Trump on show, Putin uses the time. He waits and bombards. He speaks of peace and prepares new offensives. He invites to talks, and at the same time, demonstrates that he can move on without an agreement. The big question is, who will approach him first? Trump for the big deal, or Europe out of exhaustion? And what happens if neither does? Europe staggers. While blood continues to be shed on the front lines, the grand words in Brussels are increasingly becoming mere echoes of promises. Putin's bombs destroy cities, Trump's deals destroy trust, and Zelensky's obstinacy threatens to tear down the last bridges. But the real crisis lies not in Kyiv, Moscow, or Washington, but in the middle of Europe itself, in the meeting rooms where much is spoken and little decided. For months, diplomats, journalists, even the military have been warning, Europe is losing touch. While Russia is creating facts and the US is demonstrating power, the EU is struggling with internal blockades. One wants tougher sanctions. The next fears winter protests. One talks about autonomy. The other asks Washington for protection. A continent that acts divided does not act at all. And that is exactly what every opponent takes advantage of. Putin relies on patience. Every bomb that falls increases the pressure on Europe to finally negotiate, but on his terms. Trump relies on stage. Every trip, Every meeting with Putin makes him appear bigger and Brussels smaller. Zelensky is fighting desperately, but his intransigence is increasingly seen as a risk in the West. The hero becomes an obstacle, the symbolic figure a problem. The chaos becomes noticeable for Europe's citizens. Rising energy prices, uncertainty, a political leadership that is more concerned with itself than with solutions. More and more people are asking, how much longer? What for, actually, and who really decides our fate? In talk shows, there is discussion about whether peace is more important than principles. In parliaments, the first voices are being raised that alternatives to Zelensky must be examined. What used to seem unthinkable is suddenly becoming socially acceptable. This is exactly where the turning point lies. Europe must decide. Will it remain a spectator in its own house, or will it once again shape its own future? Will it remain a recipient of orders between Washington and Moscow, or will it define its own role? There is still time, but it is running out relentlessly. The coming months are more than a phase of the war. They are a test for the European idea itself, a test of whether solidarity is just a slogan or an action, a test of whether the EU is ready to take responsibility, not only for Ukraine, but for itself. If Europe continues to remain silent, it will become a pawn in the power struggle of others. If it stands up now, it could still prove that it is more than a backdrop. The question is clear. Does Europe still want to decide for itself, or does it accept being decided for?